You want to develop a solution that uses container technology, but you can't use Docker Desktop because of the license, or maybe you just want to use an alternative. Let's go and set up our development machine so that we can use containers. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that I find you, and welcome along to the channel. So today we are going to be looking at containers, all kinds of containers. So we're going to start with looking at Windows containers. So I've got a fresh install of a Windows 11 machine. So let's go and see how we can enable using Windows containers on this machine. So the first thing that we need to do to enable Windows containers is go and enable Hyper-V. So let's go to the features aspect of Windows, and we can see here we've got the Hyper-V option, and when I drop that down you can see that Hyper-V platform is actually greyed out and the Hyper-V hypervisor is greyed out. And the reason for that is because I'm running this machine as a virtual machine, so you won't get this if you're running this as a host machine. But what we can do is, if you go to this URL and we look here, it talks all about enabling virtualization, and what you need to run in a PowerShell prompt is this particular command here to enable virtualization inside your VM, and you give it the name of the VM there. So I am going to go and do that right now, and then we'll be back and we'll carry on. Okay, so that's done and we are back inside of our virtual machine again. So let's go and check our Windows features again, and Hyper-V is now all enabled. We can select it and we get all the Hyper-V. So we need to turn all of these on. So let's do that. And that's going to ask us to reboot again, no doubt. So let's go and restart and then we'll be back again. Okay, so that's rebooted. So now let's go and download Docker. So we can go to this URL, win static stable x86-64, and we can download the latest one. You just have to pick the one with the latest date, so 2010-22. So let's download that one, and let's open that up and just extract it to our C drive. So we've now got a C Docker folder, and inside there is our Docker executable and our Docker daemon. So now that we've got our Docker daemon, we can open up a command prompt as an administrator, and first we need to go and path it through. So let's go and set some path options. So on this PC we go to Properties, Advanced System Settings and Environment Variables, and we just append onto the path a new value for C:\Docker to path it through that Docker folder. And then we can OK out of all of this, and let's just reopen that command prompt so it picks all of that up. And let's blow this up a little bit. So now if I go Docker D, it starts up, and I'm going to allow access through the firewall to that, and it says it's listening on this pipe. So if I open up another command prompt, I can do a Docker PS just to list all the containers, of which there aren't any, but it will show that it's connecting to the Docker daemon correctly. So that's a good start. So now let's go and set this up properly so that we don't have to run all these command prompts left, right and center. So the first thing that we need to do is over in the program data folder, which we can get to by doing %program data. There is a Docker folder now, so we can go into that and we can go into the config folder in there, and we can create a new text document called daemon.json or daemon.json, depending on your preference. So let's open that, and it's a JSON file, so we need our boilerplate brackets, and then inside here we can add a hosts value, and that is an array of hosts that the daemon is going to listen on, and we are going to set it to listen on all of our IP addresses on port 2376. By default, Docker uses 2375, so we're going to bump that up by 1 just so that we can prove that we are actually running on that particular port. So then we can register the Docker daemon as a service using dockerd register service, and then we can do a net start docker, and our service is running. You can also, if it's your preference, you can run up the services.msc, which brings up the services dialog, and inside here you'll see there is a Docker engine which is now running because I'm running. So that's how you can manage it as well if you are more GUI oriented rather than command line oriented. But net start does exactly the same, it starts that up. So then we can start a new command prompt, this time one that's not using the administrator, and we can do a Docker. We can tell it the host is TCP 127.0.0.1.2376 and do a Docker PS, and we see that that is talking to our Docker daemon on port 2376 as we would expect, but we don't want to have to specify this -h every time. So let's come back over to our system properties and advanced system settings and environment variables, and this time in the variables for my user I'm going to add a Docker host variable, and I'm going to put that TCP 127.0.0.1.2376 in there. So now every time we run the Docker command, it will look at that Docker host variable and pick that up. So if I exit out of this one and bring up a new command prompt, now if I just do Docker PS in here, we can see that we're now getting exactly the behavior we want. Our Docker daemon is running as a service, so I can get rid of this other command prompt, and I can just open a command prompt now and do Docker PS, and it talks to my Docker daemon. So let's just try and run a container. So let's use the default hello world, and we see that I get an error from that. So we've forgotten to turn on some more features inside Windows, so we need to turn on containers in here. Okay, so we've rebooted after enabling containers, and we're back in our command prompt again, or PowerShell. So let's try our Docker run hello world again, and we get our hello from Docker. So that's our Docker container up and running on Windows containers. And if I do a Docker image list, we can see there's my hello world Docker image that I've downloaded. Okay, so that's given us our Windows containers. So now we need to turn our attention to how we're going to handle containers that we want to run the Linux operating system on, which is usually the more common scenario. So containerization is more of a Linux thing than it is a Windows thing. So most of the platforms usually support Linux first. So you want to really be running your containers using the Linux operating system, not the Windows one. So how can we do that on a Windows desktop? So the first thing we need to do is install Windows subsystem for Linux. So we can do that using a terminal in administrator mode, and we can just do WSL install. We'll let that whiz through, and it's probably going to ask me for a reboot after that. So we'll come back after it's done all of that. So we're back after our reboot, and it's fired up this terminal on reboot saying that it's installing Ubuntu. So we'll let that do that. And that's it, we're there. We've got our new Ubuntu 22.04 version up and running, and we're logged into it inside of Windows. So that's a good start. So the next thing we need to do is turn on system D. So the way that we can do that is to do a sudo nano, and I'm no Linux expert by any stretch of the imagination, so forgive my Linux skills. But we need to come into here and we need to add to that WSL config file a boot section and a systemd equals true. Nothing more than that. And then we can output that and exit out of that. And that's Control O to do that, and Control X on Windows. And we can verify that that's installed using system control list unit files -- type equals service. And if that gives us back a load of services, which it has done, then that shows that systemd is installed. Let's carry on. The next thing we need to do is make sure that our Ubuntu is completely up to date. So let's do a sudo apt-get update. And then we're going to bring in some packages. So we're going to do a sudo apt-get install, and we are going to automatically accept those. And we want apt transport HTTPS. We want CA certificates. We want curl. We want GNU PG and LSB release. And I've spelt transport wrong. Let's go and fix that. Get all of those. And then this next command I'm going to paste in because it's just too long. But we need to curl and from Docker bring down some packages. So let's go and run this one. And before I go any further, I ought to give credit to where I got all this information from. So I got it from Marcus Lippert, and he goes through the whole idea here of installing on Windows using the subsystem for Linux. So that's where you can copy and paste all of these commands from if you need to. So where did we get to? So the next one we need to run is this one. So let's just go and do that. And then we need another sudo apt-get update. And then some more package installs. So docker CE, docker CE CLI. So let's go and get those. Okay, so I'm going to reboot Linux at this point. So I'm going to exit out of my Linux installation, come over to my other PowerShell and do a WSL shutdown, which should kill Linux. And then I should be able to reopen a Linux terminal again, and it will restart it, this time with systemd enabled. And then if I do a sudo system control status, I can see that jobs are running and the system control is actually starting services. And interestingly, I can see the containerd service is started there. So now with all of that up and running, I should be able to do a sudo docker run hello world. Pulling that image, hello from Docker, and we've now got our hello world Docker container. So likewise, I can do a sudo docker image list, and I can see the hello world is downloaded, and sudo docker ps to see that there's no containers running. So that's Docker running inside WSL. But can we get these two things working side by side so that it's easier for us to manage and work with both of these things? And we can do that. We can do that by setting up a Docker context for the Linux side of things. So what we can do is copy the config of the Docker service, and then we change our Docker service to use localhost 2375 instead of the pipe that it normally uses. So we can reload that config and then restart the service. And now Docker should be listening on port 2375. which we can prove by forcing Docker to use that particular host. So now we need to set up the host so that it defaults to this, so we don't have to keep typing this in every time. So similar to what we did inside of Windows. So we can do that by editing our bash profile, and we can do the same thing. We can set up an environment variable inside of our bash profile to just set up Docker host, and we can write that out. So now our Docker service inside Linux is on 2375. So we can come over to Windows, and inside Windows we can do Docker context create, and we give it a name of Lin for Linux, and we give it the host that it should use to reach that particular Docker context. So our port 2375. And so now with that, I can specify the context on Windows of Linux and do a Docker PS, and it shows me what's running inside the Docker daemon inside of Windows subsystem for Linux. So that's good. We've got our Windows side talking to our Linux side for our containers, so we can easily communicate for those. But what we've lost with Docker Desktop is any kind of graphical user interface for dealing with our containers. So if we're not comfortable with the command line, what can we do to help us in that regard? So there is an application out there, and there are several actually, that deal with sitting on top of the Docker daemon and help you in terms of an alternative UI in dealing with management for containers and stuff like that. One of them is this Portainer. So it gives you a nice UI representation of all of your images and what's running, and helps you manage those and tidy all of those up. So it just makes life a little bit easier than always using the command line. So let's go and have a look at how we can set this up. So inside of our Linux container, we need to do a Docker volume create, and we call it Portainer data. And then we need to actually pull down a container and run it. So it's quite a lengthy command. So I'm going to paste it in. And I'm going to need sudo on the front of that. So we're going to run the container Portainer data CE latest, so the community edition of Portainer. And we're going to expose out a couple of ports. So port 8000 and port 9443 is the default that these use for the secure ports and insecure ports. So let's run this. We can see that our Portainer container is running. So now if I go to a browser and go to https localhost 9443, we're straight in, and we can start setting ourselves up. Let's just go and do that so that we can see that this is working. So we create ourselves an admin user. And let's just go to Go Started, and let's see what we can see. So if we go into this local environment, which is our local Linux Docker daemon, we can see we've got two images, which is what we would expect, what we've done. So we've got the Hello World latest. Just blow this up a little bit. And we've got our Portainer instance as well, or image. So we can start seeing a more user-friendly approach, and we can see all the times that we've run Hello World that it's exited. So now we can do kind of useful things like tidying up the exited images. We can just go and get rid of those. Just tidies up our local environment, and we don't have to worry quite so much about the command line, but it gives us a nice visual representation of what's going on with our container environment. And that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this video. So we're now up and running. We can build Windows containers, we can build Linux containers, we can easily manage them all without Docker Desktop. So we can do this in a commercial environment where we're being constrained by the Docker Desktop license. So I hope you found this useful, and if you did, then please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as that helps this video reach more people and helps more people out. So with that, I want to thank my sponsors of the channel, without whom the channel wouldn't be growing. So thank you very much for your contributions. It's very much appreciated. The links are in the comments below, and thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.